Good afternoon and welcome to the Council of State Governments webinar entitled Nuclear Waste Policy, Defining the Problem, Searching for Solutions. This is part one of a two-part series on nuclear waste. My name is Lisa Hanairo and I'm a program director at CSG's Midwestern office. Joining me in developing this webinar series is my colleague Ann Roberts-Brody, who is a policy analyst in the Southern Legislative Conference. Ann and I want to thank Carrie Abner in CSG's national office, who's managing the logistics for the webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is being recorded. We'll post the recording on CSG's Knowledge Center and on the SLC website. We'll make sure everyone who registered receives an email with links to help you find the recorded webinar. Second, all the phone lines are in listen-only mode. That means that you all can hear us, but we can't hear you. If you wish to ask a question, please use the question pane on your GoToWebinar control panel. You may type in a question at any time during the webinar, and we'll read the questions at the end of the presentations. Finally, I want to give an important disclaimer. The Midwestern and Eastern offices of CSG receive funding from the U.S. Department of Energy to help us engage states on transportation planning in connection with nuclear waste storage and disposal. We're holding today's webinar to present information that Ann and I determined to be of potential interest to state government officials. Please note that the views expressed on this webinar are not necessarily the views shared or expressed by any CSG office or by the Department of Energy. Rather, they're intended to serve as a platform for discussion among state government officials and other interested parties. Let's turn now to defining the problem of nuclear waste. This topic is very timely because the Department of Energy is currently conducting meetings to get input from the public on ways to improve the process of identifying willing and informed hosts for nuclear waste storage or disposal facilities. Ann and I each attended one of the public meetings, and we felt state officials would benefit from learning more about how the lack of a final disposal solution is affecting the people and the companies that have to deal with the indefinite storage of spent nuclear fuel from the nation's power plants. Today we have two speakers who will help define the problem for us. First, we'll hear from Commissioner Tim Echols of the Georgia Public Service Commission. Commissioner Echols will trace the history of the Nuclear Waste Management Program and will address how the continuing delay in developing a final solution impacts both ratepayers and taxpayers. Following Commissioner Echols will be Brian Rood, who is Vice President of External and Member Relations at Dairyland Power Cooperative in Wisconsin. Dairyland owns one of the Shutdown nuclear power reactors where spent fuel is stored indefinitely. A former Wisconsin state legislator, Mr. Rood will explain how spent fuel is stored and how the delay in federal action is affecting the growing number of shutdown plants. I want to welcome both of our speakers and thank them for joining us today. Commissioner Echols, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to yet another discussion about this important topic. As we think about spent fuel storage, there's in my opinion, not enough attention being spent on this, and you look no further than the political debates that are out there, and it just doesn't seem to come up very often. And all of us that work in the energy field, we're certainly very aware of of both the direct and indirect consequences of leaving the waste at our plants, but it is a challenge to move this up the ladder of public opinion. And certainly as we think about what's going on in the field of energy today, renewables are having a heyday here, not as much as they are in countries like Germany, but we're seeing great success, even states like Georgia, where we've risen from about 37th to now I think 4th in solar power. But there are challenges with intermittent energy, and so as much as solar is, quote, sexy and everybody loves to talk about it and it's on the front page, and who doesn't want their picture made with a solar panel, there are challenges. And as cities, as states, utilities add more on the grid, we're discovering, it seems like every month we're discovering something else that maybe we need. Maybe we need smart inverters or smart transformers in order to be able to keep putting power onto the grid. So, but we've got to move forward. We've got to think about the spent fuel, and in particular, I think we've got to think about how the spent fuel and the storage of that impacts the power of the future of nuclear power. Let's go to our next slide. So if we think about the politics surrounding nuclear waste, look no further than Georgia again, and former President Carter, who who's been in the news recently with some health issues. I did have a chance to visit with President Carter earlier in my tenure and circle back with him after I wrote a national article entitled Nuclear's New Chance, just to get President Carter's opinion on what should happen to the waste. Many of you may remember he was responsible for shutting down reprocessing facilities during his administration, and he's since told me that he's changed his mind about that if we could do reprocessing in the safe way that the French are doing this and kind of mimic their system, he would be in favor of that. Of course, we've had our blue ribbon recommendations from Tim Frazier and their group that's traveled the country and really learned quite a bit, about the topic. Whether it was their recommendation about, consolidated storage, or whether it was a discussion on consent-based siting, or in communities who want to be a part of that. You think about West Texas or New Mexico, and suggestions that they've had that someone else other than DOE handled the disposition of this. Even the Heritage Foundation has proffered a plan that would involve creating another quasi-government agency that would handle kind of a public-private partnership disposition of nuclear waste. But of course, once Yucca was halted, any idea of a permanent solution, I think, was just put on hold. Let's go to the next slide. This slide shows how much spent fuel there is actually out there. So about 65,000 tons, and we've talked about the importance of moving it away from sites like Dairyland. There, having a decommissioned site and all that's sitting there now as the waste. Do we move that to a consolidated site? And then just the concern from senators that I've talked to, well, if you move it, and that state no longer has to worry about it, then we may have lost interested parties who might be a part of the solution. So I think there's this political fear out there that as you begin to move the waste and consolidate it, that now only 5 states are really worried about it, or 7 states, or wherever we might be storing that. But clearly, these consent-based meetings around the country to see what kind of deal could be struck and what that process would look like, I think that's all good. And even though every time I mention reprocessing, I get a lot of flack from people when we talk about consolidated storage or consent-based siting. It just seems like it is gaining some momentum, and we've got to ask, what kind of benefits do these communities want, and what safeguards will we build in case political leaders down the road change their mind, kind of how the folks in Nevada have done. Seems like they were initially on board, and now as time has gone on, they've moved away from that. So how do we set up a policy that takes a long time to build an infrastructure, something like a Yucca Mountain, only to have the next generation decide they don't want it after, billions and billions have been spent. Let's go to the next slide. So there's a number of current storage methods around the country. Did we skip a slide? Maybe we didn't. No, we didn't. So sorry about that. The slide that we have, you're looking at the decommissioning status, and it grieves me to see plants like Vermont Yankee closing, Pilgrim closing, and frankly, after talking with President Obama's climate czars in the White House and having them tell me a couple years ago that we can't afford to have existing nuclear power plants close if we're going to meet our 80% clean energy by 2050. So having these plants decommissioned is not a good thing. And when you replace nuclear power with even something as clean as natural gas, you still have a net increase in CO2, and that's certainly something that the administration seems to be concerned about. We'll see what happens with the next administration, whoever happens to be there. So let's go to the next slide. As we think about the current storage methods out there, and I think about the spent fuel pools that we have in Georgia that have filled up. We have Plant Vogtle, as many of you are sure familiar with, and we've recently gone to dry cask storage there. And as the pools have filled up, it's cost our ratepayers. And if they fully knew this and understood this, we might have a revolt. But think about this: we've got a mill that's already been charged per kilowatt hour. And then we come back and we spend another $250 million in buying the cask and engineering the pad and engineering the road and buying the special moving equipment and moving it out there. But then, they're a regulated utility, so they get a return on equity. It's very high, 10.95%. So they're actually, ratepayers have paid 3 times for this spent fuel. But what choice do we have, right? We've got to keep those pools open. Of course, these pools aren't designed to last forever. I mean, they begin leaking, and we just simply have to have a permanent solution because we're just not prepared to leave them on site forever. Let's go to the next slide. So if you look at what consumers have paid into the fund, out of sight, out of mind, I guess, and it's certainly not sitting in a lockbox in Washington, but it's a lot of money, and our ratepayers, depending on the numbers that you look at, I mean, you're approaching $1 billion. It's just been the problem I've had with just federal government in general, creating regulations, levying fees, and then failing to act, and then coming up with additional regulations. But we won't go into that right now. Let's go to the next slide. As we think about Plant Vogtle, as I speak today, we're having hearings during our integrated resource planning period, and Georgia Power is asking us to grant them $175 million to build, or not to build, but to go ahead and get certified another plant on the Chattahoochee River that they would wholly own. Of course, that butts up against Alabama and their sister company, Alabama Power. It's going to be quite contentious on the commission because I think our commissioners are weary. We're weary of a 39-month delay. We're weary of added cost. We've got to look at the prudency of those costs. We have a very pro-nuclear commission. I myself extremely pro-nuclear. I want to see us build more nuclear power. And the question is, do we go ahead and tee this up now, or do we wait? And I think Georgia Power feels like they really want to preserve this option. But Georgia's kind of the tip of the spear on this, and there's substantial risk involved with being at the tip of the spear. Let's go to the next slide. This photo there is the World Nuclear Exhibition. I had the privilege of representing the U.S. there with David Blee and a number of folks that you may recognize in the photo. We'll be doing that again this summer, June 28th through the 30th. Certainly invite any of you to join us in Paris for this conference, which is very well attended by French, Chinese, Russian, and some from the U.S. But as much as 1/3 of today's coal-fired capacity may be lost with what's going on in our country, and of course, new gas generation is coming on in record numbers. Renewables are expanding, but of course, we've got challenges surrounding renewables and their reliability. Let's go to the next slide. So we have to grow our nuclear capacity, and so as we grow it, so does the the fuel. And as we move away from CO2, it seems like nuclear power really is the best option. Frankly, from looking at the surveys that have been done at NARUC, not just with commissioners, I'm talking with the general public, that even Bernie Sanders supporters, if you ask them in a survey, if they are in favor of nuclear power, if they knew that it helped reduce CO2, almost 60% of Bernie Sanders supporters favor nuclear power. So I really think we've got strong public opinion if we ask the questions in the right way. Biomass is not getting any favorable treatment, and they're not going to in the future, unfortunately, and nuclear power is tied to the hip with renewables, and I think we've got to continue to remind people about that. Next slide. So we've got other issues that we've got to think about. You can see those on the slides. The lifespan of the fuel, 1 million years. The safety involved, the pools, the movement of it. Then we've got all the financial considerations of just leaving fuel at a site that's been decommissioned. All the money that's really wasted, in my opinion. So these dry casks are only designed for about 100 years. Let's go to the next slide. I just want to show you some financial numbers. If you can take a look at these. So if you think that it cost about $4.5 million to $8 million, according to the bipartisan commission, to handle the fuel at one single plant per year, and so if you multiply that out, 100 years, which is the lifespan of the actual cask, times the 60 reactor sites, we've got a figure of about 27 billion to 48 billion. Let's just call it $30 billion. While Yucca's total all-in price is about 96 billion. So this cost you're looking at on this slide is 1 year of dry cask storage at all sites, in the U.S., and that's without building any additional sites. So in 2 years, you've spent what it costs to build out a Yucca site. So I mean, these are staggering, and we certainly need to relay these kind of numbers, in my opinion, to members of Congress. Let's take a look at our last slide. Obviously, this is a very important issue in our country, and we need to continue to talk about it, and I'll be available for questions after all the presentations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Eccles. And now I will turn the floor over to Brian Rood.
Okay, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm coming at this from the standpoint of an organization which owns a shutdown facility. Dairyland Power Cooperative is a rural electric cooperative based in La Crosse, Wisconsin. We serve western Wisconsin, southeastern Minnesota, northeast Iowa, and northwest Illinois. So a little bit different size and scope in terms of numbers. We're about a $450 million organization. So let me launch into, I'll cover some of the same points that Tim raised, but try to expand on my perspective on it. So as we've heard, the situation is we're seeing a real rush for plant shutdowns. We had 4 in 2013, 1 at the end of 2014, 2 in 2015, relatively recently 1 announced for 2016. Some of those were unique events where there were expensive repairs for containment and steam generator replacement, but frankly the vast majority of these closures have been due to adverse market conditions. And the point's already been made. The charts on the right show the carbon-free electricity lost in California, for example, when San Onofre was closed down. It was greater than the carbon-free electricity from all of California's wind and solar generating capacity. So this certainly has ramifications on the Clean Air Act and issues related to global climate change. Next slide. So the market issues in brief. If you want to build these for me. Why are these nuclear plants closing? Well, in some cases, low growth or even no growth in electricity demand coming out of the 2008 recession. But probably more importantly, there's a continuing surge in the supply of low-cost shale gas, which has dramatically dropped the cost of natural gas. So the whole market, the electricity market in this country, has been driven down because of natural gas essentially setting the marketplace. In some instances, there are transmission constraints, but the bottom line is that this low price is sending price signals that are inadequate to support operating capacity, which nuclear has, or investment in new capacity except for gas-fired plants. Some of this is due to our trade policies and actions as well as mandates. But I think what we've done is in the past we've taken diversity for granted, and as a result we've undervalued it. So we have nuclear plants that have to operate 24 hours a day, 365 days a year to be practical, and they're finding that they're selling into a marketplace much of the time losing money, and so you can't do that on a long-term basis. Next slide. Well, will the Clean Power Plan, which is currently proposed by the EPA, help resolve this issue? There are some provisions of the Clean Power Plan where there's credit given for new reactors under construction and upgrades, but it does not in any way address the factors contributing to these at-risk plants. There's no economic benefit given to existing nuclear plants. It doesn't provide credit for license renewal at existing reactors, and it does incentivize mass-based system and carbon credit trading, much of the time not taking into account the benefits that nuclear is bringing. Next slide. So on to my views on used fuel storage. I think as we talked about earlier, all nuclear plants were designed with a spent fuel pool in the plant. The size and configuration vary between reactors, but everybody has stored some fuel in the site. Spent fuel pools were originally configured to contain a limited quantity of fuel. The pool capacity was increased through re-racking, and then gradually the industry began to develop dry cask storage on site to be used when the pool capacity was reached. Now originally when nuclear plants were built and when the Federal Waste Nuclear Policy Act was passed, the thinking was that fuel would be removed. Early on it was talked about reprocessing. When the reprocessing option disappeared, the federal government by law said they will take our fuel from us. So original nuclear companies, whether they're great big companies or small companies like ours, assumed the federal government would live up to its word, and so we didn't find ways to deal with the problem of fuel. But eventually industry responded with the dry cask storage option, which is now universal across the country. Next slide. This is another way of looking at the quantities of used fuel stored by state. We have a lot of fuel around the country in metric ton numbers. There you see it. Next slide. So a particular concern to me are the shutdown sites where there is not an operating reactor. If you are storing fuel on your site and you're continuing to operate, you have a revenue source to pay for that storage. For those of us who have gotten out of the nuclear business but still have to maintain our spent fuel, it's obviously 100% negative impact. There's no revenue coming in. And this group, which you see on this list, is getting larger, obviously, as these other plant announcements will move from the announced status into the shutdown site status. You'll see a variety here in terms of size and scope of the plants. You'll see a variety of geography. They are in different places in terms of what facilities they have. Some still have their facilities on site. Some have actually taken down their facility completely The Yankee companies, for example, are basically down to a storage pad. Next slide. This is our little plant. I throw this in because it's an interesting saga of how even a small company can be saddled with this issue. Our La Crosse boiling water reactor was built by the federal government as a demonstration reactor back in the 60s to show the peacetime use of nuclear power. We purchased it from the federal government in 1967 for $1. Probably not a wise investment, it turned out. We operated it very successfully for 20 years, but it was only a 50 megawatt plant. And the plants that Commissioner Eccles are talking about now under construction, and most operating plants are obviously a scale and a size much bigger than our situation. But we ended up with that 20 years of commercial operation with 5 casks of spent fuel, which you see here on the slide. They are on our site, and if you give the next slide, this is our site. The ISPAC, the site where our casks are, is circled over there on the left. We have an operating coal plant on the facility as well, which has really complicated our life in terms of security and maintenance. And I just talk about our site. If you look to the north, to the top of the slide, that's the Mississippi River. Those are barges stacked along our plant. So we have the Mississippi River on one side of our ISPAC. We have the Burlington Northern main north-south tract from the Twin Cities below our ISPAC, and then we have Highway 35. This is pretty typical of many of the sites where spent fuel is currently stored. It's really not the ideal place for storage. We think we're doing it as safely as possible. We think the public is protected. But if you were to say, where are we going to site spent fuel sites, you probably wouldn't pick a narrow strip of land between the Mississippi River, a highway, and a railroad track. Next slide. So we and other shutdown reactors participated greatly in the Blue Ribbon Commission, which President Obama appointed to talk about this issue of spent fuel. And of course, one of the recommendations of that commission on the future of nuclear power was that we should consider developing consolidated interim storage sites in the country, CIS. The commission understood and heard our plight as shutdown reactors, the fact that we don't have revenue coming in and have expenses. They said we should develop those consolidated interim storage sites, and then we should start shipping fuel first from the shutdown plants. Part of that finding in the BRC 2012 report was we would need legislative authority or action to amend the Nuclear Waste Policy Act. Obviously, when the NWPA was enacted, it very much focused on Yucca Mountain, not on consolidated interim storage. Slide. So now we're in a quandary in this country about spent fuel policy. The House Republican majority, best exemplified, I think, by Representative Shimkus, who has taken this issue on. He's a Republican from Illinois, likely to be a future Energy Committee chair. His position is that Yucca Mountain is the law of the land, that President Obama and the Congress have broken the law of the land by shutting down the Yucca Mountain process, by essentially padlocking Yucca Mountain. And his argument, Representative Shimkus's argument, is Yucca is the law of the land. What we need to do is we need to get busy with building Yucca Mountain. Within his caucus, Representative Conaway, a Republican from Texas, has actually introduced legislation to make consolidated interim storage sites a possibility. Representative Conaway includes in his district the West Texas site, which is being considered for consolidated interim storage. There's also an active project in New Mexico, and they are working very hard to achieve consent-based siting and community support and political support. In the Senate, a bipartisan group of senators have promoted the Blue Ribbon Commission CIS interim solution. They've actually introduced legislation to accomplish this. We've also seen in the House the Appropriations Chair, Mike Simpson, a Republican from Idaho, who's probably trying to walk the middle path. He's interested in consolidated interim storage, but he's consistent with his caucus position that Yucca first. Next slide. So the question, the question is compromise. Next slide. I just saw that at the bottom of the slide. So why consolidated interim storage? Well, from our perspective and why we support it so strongly is, first of all, it's much easier to build than Yucca Mountain. Even those of us, and we support Yucca Mountain certainly, even those of us who support Yucca Mountain realize that if it were restarted, if the funding were given, it's still a many-year project before it's open and available to accept spent fuel. A consolidated interim storage site is essentially a large parking lot. It's essentially taking what we have done at our various individual sites and just making it a bit larger. It would be a concrete pad for the interim storage of casks, and it would have the appropriate security and environmental measures associated with it, being equipped to deal with earthquakes and hurricanes. So it's much easier to build. We envision, the actual practical construction, you're talking a matter of months. Licensing and other related issues would take much longer than that. The technology exists. It's absolutely, it's where the fuel is at all over the country. We're just talking about consolidated, moving from the scattered sites into a location which would be perhaps one or maybe two sites where we could park this material until either Yucca Mountain opens or until reprocessing occurs, and then you could take that fuel and reprocess it. As I mentioned, when we looked at my site, we believe we are storing that fuel as safely as we possibly can. We've met all the tests. We, have, in our case, broad community support about where it's located. But the reality is, I think from a public policy standpoint, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have spent fuel sites scattered all over the country, and some of them may be considered vulnerable. The California sites, for example, are perhaps vulnerable to earthquake or tidal waves. So there's a strong argument for moving it to a more suitable site where you could have enhanced security and a better location. And as Commissioner Eccles has said, the big issue here is saving the taxpayers' money. Right now, under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act, because of the federal government's commitment to take our spent fuel, starting in 1998 was envisioned by the Act, we and every other utility that owns a nuclear plant have sued the federal government, most of us successfully, in winning settlements. I will mention that those settlements for a shutdown reactor do not begin to compensate us for all of our costs, but they are at least part compensation. I have seen estimates from the Federal Budget Office that the federal obligation is in the neighborhood of $50 billion if that fuel is not moved to Yucca Mountain, because the federal government will have to continue to pay each of us for keeping this fuel on site. Consolidated interim storage at the most might be $1 billion. And so from a fiscal conservative standpoint, the current policy is simply insane. Next slide. But there is the why the Yucca argument, which Chairman Shimkus has so eloquently expressed. His argument is, first of all, it's the law of the land, that there's no technical reason not to do Yucca Mountain. There is only political opposition. Harry Reid was very successful in stopping funding in the Senate. He's the senator from Nevada. He was also very successful, frankly, in getting the Nevada primary moved up in the cycle so that candidates go to Nevada and promise that they're not going to do Yucca Mountain. And that's exactly what happened with Barack Obama. He made that pledge as part of the Nevada primary, and he kept his word. He successfully shut down Yucca. The second argument is that final disposition requires a geologic site, and that Yucca has met at least preliminary EPA and NRC staff requirements. Even if we have reprocessing launched in this country, there will still be some materials that will be that we will need to dispose of, and all indications are that a geologic disposition is probably the appropriate long-term solution there. A strong argument that Chairman Shimkus makes is that if we have a consolidated interim storage site, let's say we move our fuel from here in western Wisconsin to Texas, we're going to have to move it twice. And he says that's an unnecessary expense. We should just wait and move it to Yucca if that's going to be the permanent disposition site. I also would mention that obviously transportation is probably the most politically sensitive aspect of the whole nuclear waste cycle. And so we're all aware of the fact that moving fuel is going to be controversial in some circles, and so you could make the argument you're going to have to make that case twice and move it twice. And then, as Commissioner Eccles, I think, mentioned, there's a real concern that a consolidated interim storage site would become the permanent repository, that the political interest in a permanent solution would disappear. The Wisconsin congressional delegation members who have been fighting to deal with this issue in Maine and California and Washington, we've had a lot of Congress representatives and senators who've been actively involved in this issue. If you have a consolidated interim storage site in Texas or in New Mexico or both, the argument would be, well, yeah, that's taken care of it. The heat will be off on Yucca, and the heat will be off on a permanent solution. So those are the arguments that we hear as to why we should not do CIS, but wait for Yucca Mountain. Next slide. Our view. Our annual cost is $2 million. It doesn't sound like very much, but that's a direct coming out of the pockets of our rural cooperative members. It's a cost that is almost at this point, because our fuel is in casks, almost all of that cost, that $2 million cost, is security. And, you know, our view is that it's not an appropriate expenditure long-term for our members. The other issue for us is that it takes time and attention of our entire organization. The CEO, vice presidents like myself, all spend an inordinate amount of time. We're fending off new regulations, worrying about nuclear waste policies, and those kind of expenses, especially for a shutdown plant, really don't ever get reimbursed. Our view is we need both consolidated interim storage and Yucca. While I respect Chairman Shimkus's position, I think that Yucca Mountain, in the best of circumstances, is 15 to 20 years away from opening. The federal government needs a solution much faster than that, both from the financial standpoint, but also from the security and safety standpoint. It just makes more sense to have this in an appropriate, safely guarded site somewhere away from the rivers and the oceans and other places where it's currently located. We clearly need a greater sense of urgency on this. I've worked for Dairyland for 16 years. Before that, I was in the state legislature for 17 years in Wisconsin. And so I've been dealing with this issue because it was in my district for 35 years. I go to meeting after meeting in Washington, and there's no sense of urgency. There's a feeling, you know, we can wait for this. We'll make a target of 2050 for reopening Yucca Mountain. There's no sense of urgency that we at the industry level feel, and frankly that many communities feel. Some communities are very anxious to have this fuel removed. They're frustrated by the lack of action at the federal government level. Politics, not science or technology, has been the issue. And I think that's very frustrating, that we seem to be caught in this war, political war. First it was the anti-nuke advocates. Now it's a fight even between people that support nuclear energy, some waiting for Yucca, some wanting consolidated interim storage. And clearly the failure to address the spent fuel issue hampers new development. If you believe that there is a role for nuclear to play because of the carbon-free emissions, if you're interested in new, smaller modular units, which might be, which are dreamed about and which might become part of the future, those things are going to be hampered when we don't have a solution to the spent fuel issue. Because anytime a state commission is going to go into debate or discussion about a new nuclear plant, this issue is going to raise its ugly head. And I think, do I have a last slide, or is that it? Oh, my closing thoughts. All right, quickly. If you'd run the slide. In an era of climate concern, loss of operating plants makes no sense. We need a policy to fix that. We need a nuclear policy based on science and respect for technology instead of politics. Politicians need to develop a realistic strategy for spent fuel. And finally, for those of you who are state legislators who are on this call, there are ways you could support this effort. We have had state legislative delegations pass resolutions calling on Congress to resolve the issue. We have commissioners represented in NARUC, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, has taken very aggressive stances in pushing the federal government to get this done, as have local governments and tribal governments. So if you have a specific concern about this, either because you have a site in your district or because you think it's bad public policy with our current law, there are ways you can help support and pressure for a solution out of Washington. Thanks for the opportunity today, and I'll take your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Rood, for those insights. We received several questions during the webinar, and the first one goes to Commissioner Echols. Commissioner Echols, nationally and really across all policy areas, the trend, particularly in Washington, has been to kick the can down the road and settle for a short-term fix. What will it take to convince those in the position to broker a permanent deal that a short-term fix is insufficient?
Wow, when you talk about public opinion about anything, I think people have a very limited capacity for political information, right? So if you just look at this, current presidential race, you can kind of see the issues that bubble up to the top, and unfortunately, spent nuclear fuel doesn't even register. So, you know, when you think about, you know, the reputation that utilities have, and you know, companies like Georgia Power, the reputation they enjoy, strong public opinion, yet they can't get this issue to bubble up. I'm a statewide elected official. I can't get this issue to bubble up. So it would require an enormous amount of coordination, and I fear that there's only a couple things that could cause that to happen. That is some kind of accident, which I don't want, some issue that would be negative, or I really think when we start moving the fuel, which is what they've done in Germany, which is what they do on a regular basis in France, that when we start moving the fuel and people know the fuel is on the roads and coming through their towns, I think it will become a more significant issue because people can see it. It's no longer just on a cask somewhere. It's coming down the road. It's on a train. And I think that will cause people on both sides to speak out, and I think at that point it's going to become a major issue. So that said, consolidated storage, I believe, will be the catalyst that gets people thinking about this.
That's a great point. Thank you, Commissioner Echols. Mr. Rood, the next question goes to you. You mentioned the soft deal that President Obama struck when he promised not to move forward with Yucca Mountain. Do you think if we see a change in administration after the current election cycle, Yucca Mountain will be back on the table?
I do. I think that Harry Reid's departure from the Senate will be a major factor because even as minority leader, he's been very effective in blocking appropriations for Yucca. The House has several times tried to put funding for Yucca in their appropriations bills. So the combination of a new president, regardless of whom it is, and Harry Reid leaving, I think reopens this discussion. And while the House Republicans have taken a very firm line about Yucca right now, I think if it's, that dynamic could change as well. I think if they feel that Yucca is restarted, even if it's a long process, even if it's a 10 or 15 or 20-year process. But if they feel there's a genuine commitment to moving in the direction of Yucca Mountain, then I think even the House Republicans might relent somewhat on this position regarding consolidated interim storage. So the other factor to keep in mind is the number of shutdown reactors continues to grow. We used to literally sit around a table in a room together, and now we need a larger conference room. That also has changed the political mix. It used to be a problem in Vermont and Maine and Massachusetts and Wisconsin and Illinois and Michigan and California, and that was about it. It's going to be a problem nationally, and so I think there will be more national attention on it and more of an interest in it. So I do think the dynamic is going to change in a positive way with a new administration or new Congress, although I have to be always mindful of the fact that spent fuel policy comes in a very painful way.
Thank you. Commissioner Eccles, we have another question for you. As a public service commissioner and a statewide elected official, what do you perceive your role to be in finding a permanent solution?
Well, certainly, you know, Georgia Power, our Public Service Commission, I mean, we have little choice about what we do with this spent fuel, right? We don't even technically own it. So I am, you know, in the role first of a caretaker, in a surrogate way, you know, by regulating the power company and making sure they have the money that they need to do, you know, the right thing with the spent fuel that we have in our pools and on the ground in Georgia. But I think I can have a larger role as a cheerleader, encouraging, helping to educate our congressional delegation. I've written letters, you know, to virtually every member of Congress in the U.S. in support of the MOX facility at the Savannah River site, because I do believe that any failure, you know, in any nuclear facility, when I say, you know, financial failure, a closure, a decommissioning, it hurts everyone. And we want to continue to have success in the nuclear industry. We obviously don't want catastrophic accidents like Fukushima. The industry can't afford that every 15 or 20 years. We have to have a perfect safety record. So I see my role primarily as a cheerleader and using my bully pulpit as a commissioner.
Thank you, Commissioner Eccles. Mr. Rood, we've got one more for you. Both you and Commissioner Eccles mentioned that without a solution for spent fuel, nuclear development will be hindered. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think from a couple of standpoints. First of all, when a state commission makes a decision on a new nuclear facility, the question of storage of spent fuel and the long-term solution is going to be on their platter, and it gives opponents of a plant, whether it's not in my backyard opponents or whether it's people who are opposed to nuclear, it gives them an issue, a valid issue to raise and to tackle. Similarly, for the communities where you might want to site a new nuclear plant, this is going to be one of the critical questions. And it's a critical question of the consent-based siting proposal. Department of Energy right now is spending a lot of time and effort to determine what consent means in a community. Well, the communities like my community of Genoa, where our facility is located, they certainly had no indication when these plants were first built that they would become a semi-permanent repository for spent fuel. And they didn't give their consent to that. So I think it hampers new development because of the whole politics that we've seen of what happens to communities where these plants are located. And until you resolve that issue, it's going to make it very difficult, not impossible, but difficult to arrive at more plant facilities opening. In the past, there's been a determination that the passage of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act essentially answered the question of spent fuel, that it had resolved that issue, and it clearly didn't. It's clearly not working. So I think from that standpoint, we need to fix this. From a political standpoint, I think the fiscal impact is certainly as real, but for communities, this is a big deal.
Thank you, Mr. Rood. And that's all the questions we received during the course of this webinar. Lisa and I would like to thank our speakers today for their time and excellent contributions, and we'd also like to thank our CSG colleague, Carrie Abner, with her help, for her help with all of the technical aspects. If you'd like to learn more about some of these issues today, we will provide links to some excellent resources. Finally, I'd like to encourage all of you to join us for the second installment of this webinar series entitled Nuclear Waste Policy, Searching for Solutions. As the title implies, this webinar will explore proposed solutions for the consolidated storage of our nation's spent fuel, and it will provide insight into the DOE's consent-based siting effort, both of which you heard much about during this webinar. Our second installment will be held on Tuesday, July 26th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Lastly, I'd like to thank all of you for spending an hour of your afternoon with us. I hope you found this webinar useful and informative. If there is anything that the Council of State Governments can do to support you in your work, please do not hesitate to contact us. Thanks again, and have a wonderful afternoon.